The sea doesn't care how good you are at surviving. 1 second, you're a trained explorer with charts, gear, and a working radio, confident enough to believe you can bargain with storms. The next, you're a weightless speck in black water, tasting diesel and salt, watching your boat disappear like it was never real. That's how it began for Ethan Cross, not with some heroic leap into legend, but with a brutal, humiliating fight to keep his lungs from filling. The waves didn't crash like water. They hit like concrete. Every breath he stole felt borrowed. Then, through the spray, he saw it. An island. Not on the map, not in his notes. A silhouette that shouldn't have been there. Too steep, too dark, rising out of the ocean like the spine of something enormous. He crawled onto its sand with torn hands and shaking legs, and for a moment he believed in mercy. He believed the island had spared him. Until the sand moved. Not with wind, not with tide, with intent. The first sign was small. A line of footprints behind him that weren't his, deep, wet impressions that appeared in the sand like the ground was remembering someone else. The second sign was worse, trees that leaned inward as if the jungle were listening. And the third sign made his stomach turn cold. He found the wreckage of other boats, and not one single skeleton, only teeth marks on metal, scratches on stone, and a strange, sour smell, like rotting fruit mixed with blood, coming from inland, pulsing with the rhythm of something alive. Ethan didn't just wash up on an island, he washed up inside a trap. And the moment he realized that, the island realized he was awake. If you've ever stared at the ocean and felt that quiet fear, the kind that doesn't scream, just whispers, you already understand why this story stays under your skin. Because shipwreck survival isn't just about the cold, the hunger, or the thirst. It's about what happens when you finally reach land and discover that land was never meant to be safe. Ethan Cross didn't set out to find mystery. He was chasing something practical, a forgotten shipping lane, rumors of missing vessels, and a pattern that didn't make sense on any official report. His plan was simple: track the route, record what he could, and come home with proof. But the storm tore the plan apart. When Ethan dragged himself onto that island's shore, he made the same mistake every desperate survivor makes. He assumed solid ground meant salvation. He assumed an island was just an island. Trees, rocks, maybe snakes, maybe insects, maybe a few days of suffering until rescue. He couldn't have been more wrong, because this place didn't behave like nature. It behaved like a predator that had learned patience. The interior was too quiet. Birds vanished at the tree line. The wind stopped whenever he spoke out loud. And at night, he heard something that made him clamp both hands over his mouth to keep from screaming. A slow, wet, dragging sound circling his shelter, as if something enormous was tasting the perimeter, deciding where to bite first. In a moment, I'm going to take you into the first chapter of Ethan's nightmare, step by step, where every decision feels reasonable until it's too late. Before we begin, subscribe if you enjoy survival stories that feel real enough to smell the salt and fear. Like the video. It helps more than most people realize. And in the comments, tell me, what country are you watching from? I read them, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the moment Ethan realized the island didn't rescue him. It claimed him. The first thing Ethan Cross understood, before hunger, before fear, before even pain, was that the island had rules. He discovered them on his knees, coughing seawater and bile into sand that looked pale in the moonlight. The shoreline was narrow, pressed tight between a black ocean and a wall of vegetation so dense it seemed stitched together. His arms trembled with exhaustion, and every time he tried to stand, his legs buckled as if the storm had stolen the idea of balance from his body. Behind him, the water dragged wreckage back and forth with a slow, grinding patience. A splintered plank, a coil of rope, the corner of a storage crate that bumped the rocks like a metronome. If he stared too long, he could almost convince himself the boat would return, like a dog that ran off and might come back when it got tired. But the boat didn't come back. Ethan's hands were raw where the salt had eaten into them. He checked his ribs and hissed when his fingertips pressed the wrong spot. Something was bruised, maybe cracked. His head rang with the dull thunder that follows a blow you don't fully remember. In the dark, he did what every experienced fieldman does. Inventory without drama. Knife, gone. Radio, gone. Dry bag, gone. Flares, gone. The small waterproof case with copies of his maps, not in sight. He had a single advantage, one thin, stubborn thread of luck. His life vest had a small emergency light clipped to the strap, and it still blinked when he tapped it. A weak pulse. But it was light. He forced himself to crawl farther from the surf, because even exhausted men know the sea steals what it can reach. He found a patch of sand near the edge of the trees, the ground slightly higher, and sat with his back against a trunk slick with humidity. The jungle smelled like wet leaves, sap, and something sour beneath it, like fruit left too long in the sun. He clicked the light again and swept it across the beach. That's when he saw the footprints. They were behind him, not ahead, deep impressions pressed into the damp sand, moving in a line that paralleled the water. They weren't his. His had been chaotic, a stagger, a crawl, a scramble. These were evenly spaced, measured. Whoever made them had been walking calmly. Ethan leaned forward, holding his breath as if the sound would carry. The prints were wrong, too wide at the front, like the foot had spread. The edges were blurred as if something had dragged slightly, but not like a tail, like skin sliding over sand. He followed them with the light until they vanished at the tide line, where the waves erased everything without apology. He turned and aimed the light into the trees. Nothing moved, no glowing eyes, no rustle. Only the thick, heavy silence of a place that should have been loud with insects and birds. The stillness felt deliberate, like the jungle was listening with its mouth closed. Ethan's mouth went dry. He licked his lips and tasted salt and copper. "Okay," he whispered more to himself than to the island. "Okay." He wasn't a man who panicked easily. He'd done the Amazon in rainy season, eaten insects when rations failed, slept in mud with a fever that could have killed him. He'd stood on cliff edges where a single wrong step meant a clean drop into nothing. Fear was familiar. It lived in the body like weather. But this felt different because it was not a danger he could see. He needed shelter. He needed fresh water. He needed to stop bleeding and stop shaking before the next problem came looking for him. Using the vest light sparingly, Ethan collected what the ocean had coughed up. A length of rope, frayed but usable, a plastic jerry can with a cracked side, 2 pieces of driftwood long enough to serve as supports, a torn section of tarp that had once covered equipment. It smelled like fuel and salt, but it was still tarp. He dragged it all toward the tree line, careful not to step where the strange footprints had been. His hands worked automatically, even as his thoughts raced. Lean-to, rope around the trunks. Tarp angled away from the wind. Driftwood crossed for support. He tied knots by muscle memory, clumsy with swollen fingers, and tested the structure with his shoulder. It held. The relief was immediate and dangerous. Relief makes you sloppy. It makes you believe the worst is over. Ethan crawled under the tarp and sat with his knees pulled up, listening to the ocean. The blinking light cast faint shadows that made the trees seem closer than they were. He told himself he'd rest for 10 minutes, just enough to stop shaking. Then he'd go farther inland at first light, find high ground, maybe spot a ship. The night answered him with a sound so faint he thought he imagined it. A slow, wet dragging, like something heavy being pulled across damp sand. It came from outside the tarp. He froze, every muscle tightening at once. The sound moved in a wide arc, circling, stopping, then starting again. Not a frantic animal, not a crab skittering. This was measured, patient. Ethan clamped a hand over his mouth. His breathing sounded too loud. He listened until his ears hurt, until the ocean itself seemed to hush, and then he heard it again. The dragging, closer now, and the soft collapse of sand under weight. The emergency light blinked. Blink, blink, blink. And with every pulse, he could swear the shadow outside shifted nearer. He reached for a piece of driftwood, the closest thing to a weapon, and held it in both hands. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He waited, eyes fixed on the thin gap where the tarp met the sand. A shape passed through the slit of darkness, low, wide and smooth. Not fur, not scales. It moved like a thick, wet rope coiling across the ground. Ethan's stomach clenched so hard it felt like pain. Then it stopped, right outside his shelter. He could smell it now, sour and earthy, like rotting fruit mixed with iodine. The odor seeped under the tarp, filling his throat. Ethan held his breath until his vision spotted with black. The shape slid away as silently as it had come. The dragging faded. The night resumed, but it didn't feel normal again. It felt like the pause after a warning shot. When the first grey hint of dawn finally bled into the sky, Ethan forced himself to move. He crawled out stiffly, joints aching, and scanned the beach. The sand around his shelter was disturbed, furrows and flattened patches as if something had pressed its body against the ground. And leading away from the tarp was a trail, not of footprints but of a smear, a broad, slick line that reflected faint light when he angled his head. He followed it for 10 steps and stopped. The trail ended abruptly at a patch of sand that looked darker than the rest, damp in a way that didn't match the tide line. Ethan crouched and touched it with one finger. The grains clung, sticky as if coated in something organic. He rubbed it between his fingertips. It didn't feel like ordinary sand. It felt like sand mixed with gel. He stood slowly. His training told him to avoid anything unfamiliar. His desperation told him he needed to understand where he was. He needed to know what the island could do. He turned toward the jungle. In daylight, the trees were worse. They weren't just dense. They were layered, vines braided over trunks, broad leaves overlapping like scales. No sunlight reached the ground beyond a few feet. The air under the canopy looked darker, heavier, as if the forest held its breath. Ethan took a step in. Instantly, the sound changed. The ocean's rhythm vanished, muffled by vegetation. His ears filled with a pressure that reminded him of diving too deep, and the silence returned, unnatural, almost complete. No bird calls, no buzzing insects. It was as if the jungle had been emptied. He pushed aside a curtain of vines and moved carefully, using a piece of driftwood as a walking stick. He expected thorns. He expected ants. He expected the sharp, relentless hostility of tropical growth. But the ground was strangely clear, not clean, just open. A narrow path, barely visible, winding through roots and ferns like a corridor. Ethan stopped, heart beating faster. Paths are made by movement. Movement means something uses them. The explorer in him, the part that had brought him here in the first place, wanted to believe it was an old animal trail. But the path's edges were too deliberate, and the way the plants bent inward gave it the appearance of being maintained. Not trimmed, not cut, just encouraged. He followed it anyway, because a man alone doesn't get to be picky. After half an hour, the humidity soaked him. Sweat ran into his eyes and made his bruises sting. He found no stream, no visible water source, only occasional pools in rock depressions that smelled stagnant. He didn't drink. Dysentery would kill him faster than thirst in a place like this. The path narrowed and dropped slightly, leading him toward a low area where the air cooled in a strange way. He noticed the smell again, sour, fermented, stronger now. He kept going because he couldn't stop himself. Then the forest opened into a clearing that made him forget to breathe. In the center was a pit, not a natural sinkhole. A wide, bowl-shaped depression in the earth, its edges smooth, as if worn by constant contact. The bottom wasn't dirt. It was a pale, pulsing mass, like sand saturated with something alive. The surface quivered in slow waves, subtle but undeniable. Ethan stared, trying to force logic onto what he was seeing. Heat shimmer, insects, some kind of algae. But this was land, not water. He picked up a small rock and tossed it into the pit. The rock landed, sank halfway as if into mud, and then the surface tightened around it. For a moment it held like a hand gripping an object. Then, very slowly, the rock disappeared beneath the pale grains. A cold wave swept through Ethan's body. He backed away, but his boot heel shifted on the edge of the clearing and crunched something brittle. He looked down. It was metal. A strip of corroded aluminum, bent and torn like it had been bitten. Beside it lay a crushed piece of plastic, half melted, with a faded warning label in a language he didn't recognize. Wreckage. Not just his. Ethan's mind raced. If other boats had ended up here, there should be bones. There should be clothing, equipment, something. But the clearing was too clean, as if the island had consumed everything that wasn't metal, and even the metal looked chewed. He crouched, examining the torn aluminum. The edges weren't snapped from impact. They were ragged, serrated, as if scraped across a rough surface with immense force. Teeth marks, the thought whispered, and he hated that his brain offered it so easily. A sound behind him made him straighten fast, not a growl, not a hiss. A soft, wet exhale. Ethan turned slowly, driftwood raised. At the edge of the clearing between two trunks, something pale slid along the ground, low and thick, moving with the same slow certainty he'd heard in the night. It wasn't a snake. It wasn't a slug. It was too big for either, and it moved without the frantic urgency of prey. It paused as if sensing him. The surface of its body glistened, reflecting thin streaks of sunlight that reached the clearing. And then, from the jungle around him, Ethan noticed other movements, subtle shifts at the base of trees, faint ripples in patches of leaf litter. He wasn't looking at one thing, he was looking at a system. Ethan's pulse hammered. He took one step back, then another, careful not to turn his back fully, careful not to run, because running triggers pursuit. Every survival instinct he had screamed to get away, but his body felt heavy, slow, like the air itself was resisting him. The pale thing slid forward an inch. The pit behind Ethan pulsed, almost as if reacting, and the path he'd followed into the clearing seemed narrower than it had before, the vines leaning inward like closing fingers. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry and tight. He lifted the driftwood higher and forced his voice to work. "No," he said, quiet but firm. "No, not today." Then he turned and ran, because sometimes the only choice you have is between panic and death is not negotiable. The path that had seemed open on the way in now felt wrong. The vines snagged his clothes as if they had grown thorns in the last minute. Roots rose like tripwires. The air thickened, making each breath feel expensive. Behind him, the wet, dragging sound multiplied. Not fast, not frantic, patient, like the island didn't need to chase him, like it only needed to guide him to the next mouth. Ethan didn't stop running until the trees thinned and the air changed, until the jungle's damp pressure gave way to the open salt of the shoreline. He burst out of the vegetation like a man escaping a burning building, stumbling down the slope and nearly falling face first into the sand. For a few seconds he could only stand there, bent over, hands on his knees, sucking in air that tasted like ocean and panic. The beach looked the same as it had at dawn. Grey water, scattered debris, his tarp shelter crouched near the tree line like a wounded animal. But Ethan's body refused to believe it was the same place. After what he'd seen in that clearing, after the pit that swallowed stone like it was hungry, the shoreline no longer felt like safety. It felt like a different part of the trap. He forced himself to slow down, Sprinting wasted water. Fear made mistakes. He walked with stiff, deliberate steps back to his shelter and checked the sand around it. The smear trail was gone. Not faded, not partially erased. Gone, as if the beach had never been touched. Ethan crouched and ran his fingertips where the wet furrows had been. Smooth, undisturbed. The tide hadn't reached this high. Wind hadn't scrubbed the sand so clean. He looked up the beach toward the rocks. No footprints, his or anyone else's, remained. The island was erasing evidence. A chill crawled up his spine, and he hated the word that formed in his mind, digesting. He shoved it away because panic loves vocabulary. Panic turns guesses into certainties. He needed 3 things immediately: water, a signal, and a better weapon than driftwood. He searched the washed-up debris again with a new kind of urgency, as if every object could be the difference between living and disappearing. He pried open the cracked jerry can, found it still reeked of fuel, and tossed it aside. He retrieved rope and a few chunks of plastic, then moved toward the rocky end of the beach, where tide pools might collect rainwater. The rocks were black and sharp, slick with algae. Ethan climbed carefully, testing each foothold. He was halfway across when his boots slid and his weight slammed into his bruised ribs. Pain flared white-hot. He clenched his teeth hard enough to make his jaw ache, then forced himself to keep moving. At the far end of the rocks, he found pools, small, shallow bowls, filled with clear water that reflected the sky. His mouth flooded with saliva at the sight. He leaned in and sniffed. No stink, no oily sheen. He dipped a finger, tasted a drop. It was fresh, not perfect, but drinkable. He drank slowly, forcing himself to take controlled sips so his stomach wouldn't cramp. The water felt like life re-entering his body, like a battery plugging back into his muscles. He filled the torn plastic container he'd found and took one last swallow. Then he noticed something in the largest pool. A thin film floated on the surface, almost invisible until the light hit it at the right angle. It shimmered faintly, like oil. Ethan reached for a stick and touched the film. It tightened, not like liquid rippling, like skin tensing. He snatched the stick away. The film relaxed again, spreading back into place, smooth and quiet. Ethan stared at it, heart thumping. Maybe it was algae, maybe it was harmless biofilm, but after the pit, after the way the ground swallowed rock, Ethan couldn't afford maybe. He left the pools and climbed back down, keeping his eyes on the sand as if it might move under him. Back at his shelter, he gathered what he could carry, rope coiled over one shoulder, the plastic container of water in one hand, driftwood in the other. He tore a longer strip of tarp, rolled it tight, and tied it to his vest like a crude pack. He needed fire. Fire meant smoke. Smoke meant rescue, if rescue even came. The thought brought a darker one behind it. What if rescue had come before, for other people, and the island had made sure they never left? Ethan pushed that away too. You don't survive by feeding the worst story in your head. He walked the beach again, collecting dry driftwood from higher sand. It was damp, but some pieces had dry cores. He found a chunk of flint-like stone in the rocks and tried to strike it against metal debris. Sparks flew, weak, inconsistent, but sparks were hope. He shredded tarp fibers and dry seaweed into a crude tinder bundle, then cupped it between his hands and worked until sweat rolled down his back. The tinder caught with a reluctant orange glow. Ethan breathed on it gently, coaxing it into flame, and for a moment he felt something close to triumph. He added thin sticks, then thicker ones, building the fire like he'd done 100 times. Smoke rose in a thin, grey ribbon. Ethan stood and waved the tarp above it, trying to push the smoke higher. He scanned the horizon, squinting into the glare. Nothing but water. No planes, no boats, no distant columns of smoke to answer his own. Still, the act of signaling anchored him. It gave his hands work, his mind focus. Then the sand near the edge of the fire shifted. It wasn't a collapse, not like a crab burrow giving way. It was a subtle ripple, a wave moving under the surface as if something had passed beneath it. Ethan froze, tarp held mid-air. The ripple traveled toward the fire. The grains of sand loosened, then tightened again. His heart hammered. He backed away a step. The ripple stopped a few feet from the flames. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the smell returned, the sour, fermented rot that made his throat tighten. It drifted toward him on a breeze that hadn't been there a second ago. Ethan's skin prickled. He looked around, searching for movement, for tracks, for anything. The beach remained clean. The sea remained indifferent. But the jungle line seemed closer. The trees leaned inward, dark and still, like a crowd watching an execution. Ethan fed the fire more wood, making it hotter, larger. He didn't know if flame repelled whatever was beneath the sand, but he was willing to gamble on it. He grabbed his water container and sat with his back to a rock, eyes fixed on the ground. Minutes passed. The ripple didn't return. He exhaled slowly, angry at himself for feeling relief again. That's when he saw it. Farther down the beach, near the tide line. A piece of wood stuck upright in the sand at an angle that looked wrong. Not driftwood. Something placed. Ethan approached cautiously. As he got closer, he recognized it. A stake, sharpened at one end, driven into the sand. Around it hung strips of fabric, faded and stiff with salt, like makeshift flags, a signal marker, a survivor's sign. Ethan's throat tightened. He knelt and examined the cloth. It had been a shirt once, maybe, torn into long pieces. The fabric was sun-bleached, but along one edge he saw stitching in a bright color, the kind used in outdoor gear. There were other objects tied to the stake, too. Bits of plastic, a metal clip, a small ring. Someone had built this deliberately. Someone who wanted to be seen. Ethan looked around. If someone had survived long enough to build a signal marker, there might be more. A camp, tools, water collection, food stashes. And if there was a camp, there might be answers about what hunted this island. He followed the shoreline, scanning carefully for disturbances that the island hadn't erased. 100 yards past the stake, half hidden behind a cluster of rocks, he found a shallow depression dug into the sand. It was lined with stones, charred black, an old fire pit. Ethan crouched beside it and felt his pulse quicken. The stones were cold, but they were positioned with intent. There were smaller rocks arranged in a ring, as if someone had tried to contain the flame against the wind. He dug gently with his fingers and uncovered something else, a small piece of melted plastic, the curved edge of what might have been a lighter. And next to it, buried deeper, he found a dark object that made him stop breathing for a second. A shoe, not his, a heavy boot, half decayed, the leather split and salt stiff. Inside was sand, no foot. Ethan pulled it free and stared at it. The boot looked like it had been chewed at the toe. The leather wasn't torn like a rip. It was scalloped, ragged, like something had scraped it with rough teeth. He swallowed hard, then forced himself to keep searching. He found more, scraps of cord, a broken fishing line spool, a corroded metal cup, evidence of a person who had tried to survive, but no body, no bones, nothing that should have been left behind. Ethan stood, boot still in his hands, and the reality pressed in on him. People had been here before, fighting the same fight, and the island had taken them clean. A faint sound from the tree line made him turn sharply, not the wet dragging this time. A whispering rustle, like leaves sliding against each other. Ethan stared at the wall of green. The jungle remained still, but the sound came again, closer, as if something moved just behind the first line of vines. He stepped backward, boot forgotten in the sand. Then a shape emerged from the vegetation. Ethan's body tensed for something monstrous, pale and glistening. Instead, what stepped out was human. A man, or what looked like one, thin, shirtless skin smeared with mud and salt, hair tangled into ropes. He held a long, sharpened stick like a spear. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and his cheeks were hollow enough to show bone beneath skin. He looked like someone who had been starving for a long time. Ethan didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his empty hands slowly to show he wasn't a threat. The man stared at him with an expression that was not relief, not hope. It was terror. The stranger's gaze flicked past Ethan, down to the sand near his feet, as if the ground itself had spoken. His lips parted, and his voice came out as a cracked whisper. "Don't. Stand still." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" The man shook his head violently, eyes darting. "It hears you. It feels you. If you stop, if you freeze, it learns your weight." Ethan's skin crawled. "What is it?" The man took a step forward, then stopped abruptly, as if an invisible line held him back. He stabbed his spear tip into the sand, hard enough to make a small hole. The sand tightened around the spearhead, not immediately, not like quicksand, like something closing its grip. The man yanked it free and backed away, breathing fast. "It's not one thing," he whispered. "It's the island." Ethan felt his heartbeat in his throat. The stranger's words sounded insane, but nothing about this place fit sanity. "I need water," Ethan said, keeping his voice controlled. "I have some. We can—" "No!" the man snapped, sudden anger flaring. Then his expression crumbled into fear again. "Water brings you inland. Inland is where it feeds." Ethan glanced toward his fire smoke, now faint in the distance. "I'm signaling. If someone sees—" The man barked a laugh that was almost a sob. "They saw mine too." He pointed with his spear toward the stake with the torn cloth. "I made it higher, bigger. I burned green wood, smoke for days." His eyes glistened. "And when a boat finally came close enough to see me, the island—" He swallowed, throat working like he was forcing words past a knot. "The island made the waves rough, like it didn't want to let the sound carry, like it didn't want the boat to stop." Ethan's mind fought itself. Storms happen, currents shift, waves change, but the ripple under the sand, the erased tracks, the tightened film on the tide pool, it all pointed in the same direction. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. The man hesitated, then said, "Caleb." His voice softened for the first time. "My name is Caleb." Ethan nodded. "Ethan," Caleb's eyes sharpened, "you came in on a boat." "Yes, storm took it." Caleb's jaw clenched as if in rage at the ocean itself. "Same." Ethan took a careful step toward him. "How long have you been here?" Caleb's gaze drifted, unfocused. "Long enough to forget what day means." He lifted the spear slightly. "Long enough to learn the rules." Ethan held still. "Tell me the rules." Caleb's lips trembled. He looked at the sand, then at the tree line, then back at Ethan. "Rule 1. Never sleep on bare ground. It likes warmth. It likes the pressure of a body." He gestured toward the rocks. "I sleep on stone when I can, or in trees if the branches hold." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he remembered the slick smear by his shelter, the way something had pressed against the tarp. "Okay. Rule 2. Caleb continued, voice tightening. "Don't bleed. Don't let it taste you. If it gets your blood into the sand, it follows you like a dog." Ethan's bruised ribs throbbed. His scraped hands stung. He curled his fingers into fists to hide them. Caleb's eyes flicked to Ethan's hands anyway. He saw. His face went pale. "You're cut. Small," Ethan said quickly. Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then don't stand still." A ripple moved under the sand between them, faint but unmistakable. It traveled like a slow wave, closing the distance. Ethan's body surged with adrenaline. He stepped back, then another step. Caleb did the same, spear lifted. The ripple followed, patient and straight as if guided by their weight. Caleb's eyes went wide. "It knows." Ethan's mouth went dry. "How do we stop it?" Caleb stared at the fire smoke in the distance, then at the rocks. His breathing came fast. "We don't stop it," he said. "We stay ahead of it." The ripples sped up, still slow compared to running, but faster than before, more certain. Caleb grabbed Ethan's arm with a hand that felt like bone and salt. "Move," he hissed. "Now!" They backed toward the rocks, careful not to trip, careful not to fall. The sand behind them looked normal, but Ethan could feel the truth under it. Something alive, something reading them through pressure and heat. As they reached firmer ground, Caleb pulled Ethan up onto a flat rock shelf. Ethan's boots scraped stone, and the ripple halted at the edge of the sand like a tide hitting a wall. For a second, everything went still. Then the sand beneath the ripple bulged upward slightly, just a subtle rise, like a breath held too long. Ethan stared, frozen despite Caleb's warning. The bulge slid sideways, searching for another route, and Ethan realized with a sick certainty that the island wasn't blocked. It was thinking. Caleb leaned close, voice shaking. "If it can't take you here," he whispered, "it'll make you go where it can." Ethan followed Caleb's gaze inland, toward the jungle path that now seemed darker than before, as if the shadows had deepened. From within the trees came that soft, wet exhale again, closer, multiplied, like several lungs breathing through one mouth. Ethan tightened his grip on the driftwood, knuckles white, as the first pale glisten of something moving appeared between the vines. Ethan stayed on the rock shelf, knees bent, chest rising in shallow breaths as he watched the first pale movement thread between the vines. Whatever it was, it didn't rush. It didn't charge. It simply advanced the way a tide advances, inevitable, calm, and certain it will win. Caleb's fingers crushed Ethan's forearm. "Don't stare," he whispered. "It likes when you stare. That's when you stop thinking." Ethan forced his eyes away and scanned the ground, the angles of escape. Rock behind them, sand in front, jungle to the side. His fire was a dull smear of smoke farther up the beach, already losing its height. The wind had shifted again, pushing it low, dragging it along the water as if the island had reached out and pressed a hand on its throat. "What do we do?" Ethan asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Caleb lifted his spear and tapped the stone beneath their boots. "We stay on what it can't swallow," he said. "Rock, dead coral, anything that doesn't give. And we don't go inland unless we have a path of stone all the way." Ethan swallowed. "And if we don't?" Caleb's eyes flicked toward the sand where the ripple had stopped. The bulge under the surface shifted sideways, searching, learning. "Then it teaches you," Caleb said softly. "It teaches you fast." The pale shape at the tree line paused, as if listening to the word teaches. Ethan caught a glimpse of it now, something like a thick, muscular ribbon sliding along the ground, its surface smooth and wet, reflecting daylight in thin, unsettling streaks. It wasn't a single creature, so much as a moving piece of something larger, like a limb sent to test the perimeter. Caleb backed along the rocks, pulling Ethan with him, staying 2 steps away from sand at all times. Ethan copied him. Every time his boot came close to the loose grains, his stomach clenched. He could feel the island under it, not as a monster with teeth, but as a system that felt their weight like fingertips pressing on a drum. They moved along the shoreline, where black stones jutted out like broken teeth. The ocean slapped the rocks with bored aggression. Ethan glanced back once and regretted it immediately. The sand bulge had grown. Not higher, just broader, as if something beneath it had spread its body out, flattening, becoming more surface than mass. The pale ribbon at the tree line retreated 1/2 inch, then slid sideways, mirroring their direction. It wasn't chasing. It was positioning. Caleb led Ethan around a bend where the beach narrowed and the rocks formed a natural corridor. Here, the sand was squeezed into a thin strip, and the rock rose higher, forming a shelf above the tide line. Caleb climbed it quickly, bare feet finding grips Ethan didn't see. Ethan followed, ribs screaming with every pull. At the top, the view widened, a crescent bay, the wreckage line, the jungle wall, and beyond it, the island's interior rose in a series of dark ridges, as if a spine ran through the center. Mist hung over those ridges even in daylight, thin and unmoving, like breath held in the lungs. Caleb crouched and pointed. "My camp is that way," he said, nodding toward a cluster of boulders that formed a shallow cave above the shore. "We rest, we plan, then we move. Not later, not tomorrow, today." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to say he needed time, needed to think, needed to wait for rescue, but the island had already answered that hope by pressing smoke down and erasing tracks. And Caleb, for all his gaunt terror, was alive. That meant something. They reached the boulder cluster and slipped into the shade of the makeshift cave. The air inside was cooler and smelled less like rot. Caleb had arranged flat stones in a raised platform, and above it he'd wedged driftwood to keep the ceiling from dripping. A crude nest of dried palm fronds sat on top, thin, uncomfortable, but off the sand. Ethan sank onto the stone platform, chest heaving. Caleb kept standing, eyes constantly shifting to the opening, as if expecting the jungle to slide forward and swallow daylight. "You've been here long," Ethan said, catching his breath. "How long, Caleb?" Caleb didn't answer at first. He reached into a crack between rocks and pulled out a metal tin with a dented lid. He opened it and showed Ethan what was inside, a handful of dried strips of something, fish maybe, dark and tough. "Eat," Caleb said, "small bites. Don't vomit." Ethan took one strip and chewed. It tasted like salt and old smoke, but it was food. His body clung to it like a drowning man to driftwood. Caleb sat finally, spear across his knees, and rubbed his face with both hands, like he was trying to wipe away a memory. "I stopped counting days," he said. "I counted storms. I counted moons. Then I stopped counting those, too." Ethan swallowed another bite. "How many people were with you?" Caleb's eyes tightened. "4," he said. "Me, my brother, and 2 crew. We were moving cargo along a route nobody uses anymore, shorter but dangerous." His voice turned hollow. "The weather hit like a wall. We saw this island the same way you did, like it appeared out of nowhere. We thought it was luck." Ethan didn't interrupt. He already knew where luck ended. Caleb continued, voice low. "My brother stepped onto the sand and laughed. He said, 'We're saved.' He walked inland because he saw trees and thought fruit, water, shade. I followed him. The others stayed near the wreck, building a signal fire." Caleb's throat bobbed. "We heard him scream once, just once, and then the forest was quiet again." Ethan felt cold crawl up his back. "You didn't find him?" Caleb shook his head slowly. "I found his knife," he whispered. "I found the handle, not the blade." Ethan's stomach clenched around the dried fish. He forced himself to swallow. Caleb leaned closer, eyes bloodshot and intense. "Listen to me. This island doesn't hunt like an animal. Animals chase. Animals bite. This waits." He pointed beyond the cave, toward the sand line. "It feels pressure. It feels warmth. It learns patterns. If you sleep in one place, it changes the ground. If you bleed, it follows the smell. If you panic, you run into the places it wants you to go." Ethan's mind reached for explanations, like a man grabbing branches in a flood. "So what is it? A plant, a fungus, a parasite?" Caleb stared at him for a long moment. "It's everything," he said. "Or it uses everything. I've seen the sand move without wind. I've seen pits swallow metal like it was soft. I've seen water film tighten like skin." He swallowed hard. "And I've heard things." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Heard what?" Caleb's voice dropped. "Voices," he whispered. "Human voices. Calling from the trees. My brother called my name once. It sounded like him. It sounded exactly like him." Ethan's blood chilled. "That's impossible." Caleb's eyes flashed with anger. "So is the ground eating people," he snapped. Then his anger collapsed into trembling fear. "But it does." Ethan looked out through the cave opening. The beach seemed peaceful from here. Sunlight on water, quiet waves, birds in the distance, far out at sea, never crossing over the island. He realized with a sick twist that he hadn't seen a single bird land since he arrived. No gulls, no insects, nothing fed here. Caleb reached into the tin again and pulled out a coil of braided vine. "I've got one chance," he said. "A path." Ethan sat up. "What kind of path?" Caleb pointed toward the ridges in the distance. "There's a spine of rock that runs inland," he said. "Basalt, sharp, old. It rises above the sand pockets. If we can stay on it, we can reach higher ground." He exhaled slowly. Higher ground means wind. Wind means smoke rises. And higher ground means we might see passing ships. Ethan's hope flared, then a darker thought followed. And if the rock spine ends? Caleb's eyes didn't blink. "Then we don't step off," he said. "Or we die." Ethan looked down at his hands. The cuts across his knuckles were small, but they stung. He remembered Caleb's second rule: don't bleed. He tore a strip of tarp from his bundle and wrapped his hands tightly, knotting it around his wrists. Caleb watched and nodded once. "Good," he said. "You learn fast. That might save you." They waited only long enough for Ethan to eat and drink, then moved. Caleb insisted they put out Ethan's beach fire completely. "Smoke brings eyes," he said, and when Ethan asked what eyes he meant, Caleb simply shook his head and refused to elaborate. They traveled along rock as much as possible, stepping from shelf to shelf, avoiding sand like it was acid. The basalt spine began near the far end of the bay, rising out of the ground in jagged slabs. Ethan climbed carefully, ribs throbbing, breath ragged. Once they reached the first ridge, the island changed again. The air grew cooler. The rot smell faded into something sharper, mineral, like wet stone and iron. The jungle below looked darker from above, a solid mass of green that didn't move even when wind brushed the ridge. It reminded Ethan of a blanket pulled tight over a sleeping body. Caleb moved with a strange confidence now, like a man navigating a minefield he'd crossed before. "Stay where I step," he warned. "The rock isn't always rock." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Caleb stopped and tapped the ground with the butt of his spear. The surface looked like stone, but when he pressed, it yielded slightly, like a hard crust over soft mud. "It grows over rock," Caleb said. "It covers things, makes them look safe." Ethan's throat tightened. "So it camouflages." Caleb nodded. "Or it learns what fools us." They continued upward. The ridge narrowed, forcing them into single file. On either side, the drop was steep, down into dense forest and shadowed pockets Ethan couldn't see into. The sun above felt distant, muted by a thin mist that clung to the island's spine like a shroud. Halfway up, they came to the first cliffhanger of the day. Ethan noticed a line of objects wedged between rocks ahead, dark, geometric shapes that didn't belong to nature. As they approached, he recognized them. Old equipment cases, metal and plastic, faded stickers, a rusted tripod, a camera housing cracked open like a skull. Ethan's pulse quickened. Someone explored here. Caleb's face tightened. "Yes," he whispered. "And the island kept their toys." Ethan picked up the cracked housing. Inside, where a camera should have been, there was nothing, just a smear of dried residue and a sharp, sour odor that made his eyes water. "No bodies," Ethan muttered. Caleb didn't answer. He pointed instead at a flat section of rock where a message had been scratched in shallow grooves. The letters were rough, carved with desperation. "Help us, it moves underground. Don't trust the trees." Ethan stared, feeling his skin prickle. The message looked old, weathered but still readable, as if the island allowed it, like a signpost in a maze. "Who wrote that?" Ethan asked. Caleb's voice was barely audible. "I don't know," he said, "but I found it weeks ago. And the day after I found it, I heard a woman crying in the jungle below, calling for her father." He swallowed. "I didn't go. I didn't answer." Ethan's stomach turned. He wanted to believe Caleb had imagined it, but the island had already proven it didn't need permission to be impossible. They moved on. The ridge climbed higher, then leveled out into a plateau of uneven stone. Here the mist thickened, and the world beyond the island blurred into grey-white nothing. Ethan could barely see the horizon. He could, however, see something else, a structure. At first it looked like a pile of rock, but as they got closer, angles emerged, straight lines and corners that nature rarely makes. A low, bunker-like building, half swallowed by vines, its roof cracked, its doorway a dark rectangle. Caleb stopped, spear lifted. "I don't like this place," he whispered. Ethan's voice was tense. "But it's shelter and high ground." Caleb shook his head. "Shelter is where you stop moving," he said, "and stopping is—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Ethan approached the doorway carefully, keeping his feet on stone. The structure's walls were concrete, stained with age and black streaks. A rusted metal plaque hung beside the entrance, the words eaten by corrosion. Ethan could only make out a few letters, station, and maybe a year. Inside, the air smelled dry at first, old dust and rust. Then the sour rot hit again, faint but present, like a reminder that the island reached everywhere. Ethan swept his small emergency light across the interior. The beam caught on objects that made his breath catch. A table, collapsed. Shelving, empty. A radio console, ancient knobs missing, and on the far wall a map pinned under cracked glass. Ethan stepped closer and froze. The map showed the island, not a blank spot. Not an unknown shape. It had a name, blurred but still legible enough to read. Sable Key. Ethan's heart hammered. This place was known, he whispered. Caleb entered behind him reluctantly, eyes scanning the corners. "Known doesn't mean safe," he said. Ethan studied the map. There were markings, routes, notes, warning symbols. Someone had charted currents around the island, circling certain areas in red. In the center of the island, a bold X had been drawn with the word beneath it, partially smeared, but unmistakable. Core. Ethan looked up. "Core," he said aloud, and the moment the word left his mouth, the building seemed to answer. A low vibration rolled through the floor. So subtle at first, Ethan thought it was his heartbeat. Then it grew. A faint tremor that made dust shift on the table and the hanging map rattle against its glass. Caleb grabbed Ethan's shoulder hard. "Don't!" he hissed. "Don't speak like that in here." Ethan swallowed. "What is this? A research station?" Caleb's eyes were wide. "I told you," he whispered. "It hears, it feels, it learns." The tremor stopped as suddenly as it began. Silence returned, thick and watching. Ethan found a metal cabinet in the corner and yanked it open. Inside were papers, moldy and stuck together, but some still readable. He pulled one free carefully. The heading was faded, but he could make out the word observation, and beneath it, a line that made his throat tighten. Udu substrate exhibits responsive movement to pressure and heat. Ethan stared, mind racing. Responsive substrate. Pressure and heat. That matched everything. The ripples, the bulges, the tightening film. Caleb stepped back, eyes darting to the doorway. "We need to go," he said, "now." Ethan didn't want to. The station was proof. It was answers. It was the first sign that this nightmare had a history. But the air had changed again. The sour odor intensified, and Ethan realized it wasn't coming from one spot. It was rising evenly, like a tide filling a room. The floor trembled again, stronger this time, enough that Ethan felt it in his teeth. Caleb grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward the exit. "Move!" he insisted. "Move, or it locks us in!" Ethan stumbled outside onto the plateau. The mist had thickened into a wall. Visibility dropped to a few yards. The world felt smaller, tighter, as if the island had wrapped its arms around them. Caleb pointed toward the ridge beyond the station. "We go to the highest point," he said. "We signal. We don't stop until we can see the sea again." They moved fast along the plateau, stepping over cracks and jagged stone, using the spear and driftwood as balance. The mist clung to Ethan's skin, cold and damp. His wrapped hands were slick with sweat beneath the fabric. And then came the second cliffhanger, so sudden it stole Ethan's breath. A sound drifted through the fog, a voice. "Ethan!" It wasn't a shout. It was a soft call, like someone speaking from close by. The voice held his name with eerie familiarity, as if it had practiced it. Ethan froze before he could stop himself. Caleb spun and slapped Ethan's shoulder hard. "Don't," he hissed. "Don't answer." The voice came again, a little clearer. "Ethan! Over here." Ethan's mouth went dry. He hadn't told Caleb his full name. He hadn't shouted it. He'd only said it once, quietly in the cave. Yet the fog was calling him like an old friend. Caleb's eyes were wild. "It copies," he whispered. "It pulls." Ethan forced his legs to move again, but his skin crawled with the instinct to turn, to look, to confirm the impossible. The fog thickened at their backs, and the voice shifted position without footsteps, without rustle, appearing now to the left, now to the right, as if it came from the mist itself. "Ethan, please." The tone changed. It sounded desperate, human, real enough to break a man. Caleb grabbed Ethan's wrist and tugged him forward. "Ignore it," he said through clenched teeth. "If you listen, it learns the shape of your hope." They reached the ridge's next rise, and as they climbed, the mist thinned just enough to reveal the plateau behind them. Ethan's stomach dropped. The station building, half swallowed by vines, was sinking, not collapsing, not crumbling, sinking, slowly, as if the ground beneath it had softened and was pulling it down like a mouth swallowing a bite. The concrete edges vanished inch by inch into the earth. The doorway darkened as the floor lowered. Ethan stared, unable to speak. Caleb didn't look back. "Keep moving," he said, voice shaking. "That's what it does to things that stay." They climbed higher, until the air sharpened with wind. The mist tore in thin ribbons, revealing the ocean far below on both sides of the island. Ethan's chest tightened with a surge of hope. High ground meant visibility. Visibility meant rescue. At the peak of the ridge, a natural spire of stone rose like a broken tower. Caleb pointed. "There," he said. "We signal from there." Ethan followed, nearly slipping on wet rock. When they reached the spire, the view opened wide. Endless sea, bright sky, and in the distance, a faint dark line on the horizon. A ship. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. "Do you see it?" he asked, voice breaking. Caleb squinted, then nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "Real. Not fog." Ethan's hand shook as he pulled the last strip of tarp from his bundle. He waved it hard, arms burning, praying someone would notice. Caleb did the same with a faded cloth from his camp. The ship remained distant, but it moved steadily across the horizon. If it kept course, it would pass within signaling range. Ethan's hope rose like a flame. And then, as if the island felt that flame, the third cliffhanger arrived. The wind shifted violently, not a natural gust, an abrupt, deliberate push that slammed mist back up the ridge. A thick bank of fog surged over the peak, swallowing the horizon in seconds. The ship vanished behind grey-white nothing. Ethan cursed under his breath. He waved harder. The fog dampened the cloth, making it heavier. Caleb's face twisted with rage and helplessness. "It's doing it," he whispered. "It's hiding us." Ethan refused to accept it. He stepped closer to the spire's edge, leaning out into the fog as if he could force the world to reappear. "Hey!" he shouted, voice ripping from his throat. "Hey!" Caleb lunged and grabbed him, yanking him back. "Don't shout," he snapped. "That's what it wants." Ethan tore free, furious. "If we don't shout, we die here." Caleb's eyes filled with a terrible certainty. "If you shout," he said, voice trembling, "you die faster." The fog swirled, and for a heartbeat, Ethan saw something below. Movement on the ridge slope, pale, glistening shapes sliding upward over rock like wet muscle searching for grip. The island was adapting. It was learning to climb what had once been safe. Ethan backed away, breath coming in sharp bursts. "It's coming up here," he whispered. Caleb's face went ashen. "It never came up here before," he said. The rock beneath their feet trembled, faint but unmistakable, like something massive shifting its weight deep below. Ethan looked at the spire, the fog, the hidden ship, and the pale shapes inching closer up the ridge. He realized with a cold clarity that the island wasn't just hunting them. It was preventing escape. Caleb's voice cracked. "We have one choice," he whispered. "We go to the core." Ethan stared at him. "That's the center," he said. "That's where it feeds." Caleb nodded, eyes shining with fear. "Exactly," he whispered. "If it's stopping us from leaving, it means the only way out is to hurt it, or distract it, or—" he swallowed hard, "or give it something else." Below them, the pale glisten grew closer, sliding over stone that should have been solid and safe. Ethan tightened his grip on the driftwood until his knuckles whitened under the wraps. For the first time since the shipwreck, he understood the island's final rule. It would not let them survive by running. It would only let them survive by fighting the place they were standing on. The fog thickened until it became a wall, swallowing the peak and turning the world into a damp, grey room. Ethan could no longer see the ocean. He could barely see Caleb's face. All he had was the feel of rock under his boots and the faint tremor running through it like a pulse. Below them, the pale shapes kept sliding upward, not fast, not loud, just certain. Caleb grabbed Ethan's sleeve and pulled him away from the spire's edge. "We go now," he said, voice tight, "before it learns this ridge completely." Ethan's throat felt raw from shouting. "You said the core," he rasped. "How do we even find it?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He crouched and pressed his palm flat to the stone. He stayed like that for several seconds, eyes half closed, as if listening with his skin. Ethan stared. "What are you doing?" Caleb opened his eyes, and the fear in them had shifted into something darker. Resolve, maybe. "Feeling it," he whispered. "The island has a rhythm. It pushes, then rests. If you move when it rests, you can cross places that would swallow you when it pushes." Ethan's stomach tightened. "You're telling me it has a heartbeat?" Caleb's jaw clenched. "I'm telling you it's alive enough to time." The tremor beneath them eased for a moment, like an exhale. Caleb stood. "Now," he said. They moved down slope along the ridge, in a hurried, careful descent. The fog stayed thick, but Caleb navigated by memory, counting steps, choosing certain slabs, avoiding others. Ethan followed exactly, planting his boot where Caleb's foot had been, refusing to question it, because questioning meant stopping, and stopping meant the island learned your weight. A sudden slickness under Ethan's foot made him flinch. He steadied himself, heart racing, and looked down. The rock was wet, not with rain, not with mist, with something thicker, like mucus. Ethan swallowed hard and forced his eyes forward. They reached the plateau again where the station had been. But the building was gone now. In its place was a shallow depression filled with pale, shifting grains, like the pit Ethan had seen earlier, but wider. The earth quivered softly, as if digesting its last meal. Ethan stared, stunned. "It swallowed the station." Caleb didn't slow. "It swallows anything that stays," he said, "even proof." Ethan's mind flashed to the carved message, the equipment cases, the map, all of it. Answers being erased like chalk in rain. Caleb led him around the new pit, stepping only on jagged basalt that jutted like islands in a pale sea. Each jump felt like gambling with his life. His ribs screamed, his wrapped hands burned with sweat. Halfway across, Caleb froze abruptly. Ethan nearly collided with him. "What?" Caleb raised a hand, silencing him. His eyes were wide, fixed on the fog ahead. Ethan listened. At first, there was only the faint hiss of wind and their own breathing. Then came a sound that made Ethan's blood turn cold. A human sob, soft at first, like someone trying not to be heard, then louder, broken, desperate. The sobbing came from just beyond the fog, close enough to feel intimate, close enough to feel real. Ethan's instincts screamed to help, to run forward, to call out. Caleb's grip tightened on Ethan's arm. "Don't!" he whispered, voice shaking. The sobbing shifted into words. "Please, please, I'm here. I can't move." It was a woman's voice, weak, strangled with fear. Ethan's throat tightened. That could be real. Caleb's eyes flashed. "So was my brother's voice," he said. "And when I ran toward it, I stepped where the ground looked solid. I only lived because I threw myself onto rock fast enough to tear my skin off." Ethan stared at the fog. The voice came again, pleading, "Help me! I can hear you!" He took one step forward before he could stop himself. Caleb yanked him back violently. "If you go," he hissed, "it doesn't just eat you, it learns how to use you next." Ethan's stomach churned. "So what do we do? Ignore people?" Caleb's voice cracked. "We ignore voices," he said. "We ignore everything that wants us to stop." The fog swirled, and for a second Ethan saw a shape, a hunched silhouette on the ground, arms wrapped around knees, shaking. His heart lurched. It looked human. He blinked, and it was gone. They moved again, faster now, pushing across the basalt spine toward the island's interior. The jungle below rose up like a tide of leaves. The farther inland they traveled, the stronger the sour odor became, mixing with a metallic tang that reminded Ethan of blood on warm stone. The basalt spine began to descend toward the center of the island. Here rock gave way to patches of earth, and Caleb's movements became more cautious. He tapped each step with his spear, testing for firmness, listening for the wrong sound. Ethan noticed something else as they descended. The silence was changing. It wasn't total anymore, it was layered. Soft creaks from trees, a faint wet shuffling beneath leaf litter. Tiny clicks like pebbles shifting, but too rhythmic to be random. It felt like walking through a room full of people who were pretending to be asleep. Caleb stopped at the edge of a narrow ravine where the basalt spine broke. On the other side, rock continued, but between them was a stretch of dark soil scattered with leaves. It looked normal. Caleb stared at it like it was a cliff. "This is the worst part," he whispered. Ethan's mouth went dry. "Because it's not rock." Caleb nodded. "Because it's pretending," he said. The tremor beneath their feet eased again. Caleb's rest. He inhaled, then exhaled slowly. "We crossed during the rest," he said. "No hesitation, no running, smooth steps, like you belong here." Ethan stared at the soil. The idea of stepping onto it made his skin crawl. Caleb looked at him sharply. "If you freeze, it learns you," he said. "If you panic, it guides you. You cross like you're walking across a kitchen floor." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded once. Caleb stepped first, spear held out for balance. His feet pressed into the soil, leaving shallow impressions. Nothing happened. He kept going, steady, almost calm. Ethan followed. The ground felt wrong the second his boot touched it, too soft, too alive, like a mattress layered under leaves. He forced himself to walk, each step deliberate, smooth, refusing to show fear. Halfway across, the tremor returned. Not a full pulse, a small shiver. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes widened. "Faster," he whispered. Ethan's heart pounded. He forced his legs to move quicker without breaking into a run. The ground behind him shifted subtly, like something turning in its sleep. He was 3 steps from the far rock when his left boot sank deeper than it should have. Ethan's breath caught. The soil tightened around his ankle, not like mud suction, like a hand closing. He jerked, trying to pull free. The grip tightened, rising to his calf. Caleb lunged and grabbed Ethan's arm. "Don't fight it," he hissed. "It wants you to thrash." Ethan's panic surged. "It's got me!" Caleb planted his spear tip into the soil near Ethan's trapped leg. Instantly, the ground tightened around the spear too, as if angry. Caleb yanked it back and thrust it again, not to stab, but to distract, forcing the ground to choose between grips. Ethan felt the pressure around his leg loosen slightly. Caleb seized the moment and hauled Ethan forward with a brutal tug that sent a spike of pain through Ethan's ribs. Ethan's boot tore free with a wet sound that made his stomach twist. They stumbled onto the rock on the far side and collapsed, gasping. Behind them, the soil bulged as if offended. The leaves shifted in a slow wave, smoothing back into place, pretending again. Ethan stared at his boot. Dark residue coated the sole, sticky, pale grains mixed with something gelatinous. Caleb's face was pale. "It almost had you," he whispered. Ethan's voice shook. "That wasn't sand. That was it." Caleb nodded, eyes distant. "That was its skin," he said, "or its tongue." They rested only long enough to regain breath, then continued. The basalt spine rose again, steeper now, leading toward a depression in the center of the island where mist seemed to gather like a pool. The smell grew stronger, and Ethan felt a deep nausea that had nothing to do with hunger. As they approached the depression, they found another sign of past people. A backpack wedged between rocks, half rotted but intact enough to hold shape. Caleb hesitated, then pulled it free. Inside were items that made Ethan's chest tighten. A cracked satellite phone, dead, a compass, a small journal sealed in a plastic bag. Ethan's heart raced. A journal! Caleb looked like he wanted to throw it away, like evidence itself was dangerous. But Ethan reached out and took it carefully. The plastic bag crackled. The pages were damp but readable. He opened it to the last entry, written in shaky, desperate handwriting. "We thought it was an island. It's not. It's a body. The sand is the surface. The pits are mouths. The trees are not trees, not all of them. Some are feelers. It reacts to sound. It reacts to warmth. It reacts to attention. If you think of leaving, it tightens the sea. If you try to signal, it changes the wind. It doesn't want rescue, it wants repetition." Ethan's hands trembled. He flipped back another page. "We found the core. It pulses. It's warm. It smells like iron. It's where it pulls everything. We think if we hurt it, we can force it to spit us out, force it to change. But we are running out of time. The ground is learning our weight." Ethan looked up at Caleb. "Other people tried to hurt it." Caleb's face was grim. "And they failed," he said. Ethan swallowed. "Or they got close." Caleb stared toward the mist-filled depression ahead. "That's where we're going," he said. "That's the core." They descended into the depression, and the world changed in a way Ethan felt in his bones. The air grew warmer, almost feverish. The ground beneath the basalt spine vibrated constantly now, not in pulses but in a steady hum, like an engine idling under the earth. The mist here wasn't cold, it was warm and damp, clinging to skin like breath from a mouth. The jungle around them thickened, but it wasn't silent anymore. It made subtle sounds, soft clicks, wet shifts, faint creaks, like a living structure adjusting itself. Then the basalt spine ended. Ahead was a wide basin of pale ground, sand mixed with that gelatinous sheen, stretching out like an exposed organ. In the center of the basin rose a mound, rounded and smooth, pulsing slowly. Each pulse made the surface glisten, as if sweat formed and vanished. Caleb stopped at the edge of rock and stared, breathing shallowly. Ethan's stomach turned. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the core." Caleb nodded, eyes glassy. "It's warm," he said. "You can feel it from here." Ethan did feel it, heat radiating faintly, like standing near a sleeping animal. The mound pulsed again, and Ethan realized the rhythm matched the tremors he'd felt all day. This was the source, the heartbeat. Ethan looked at Caleb. "How do we hurt it?" Caleb's jaw clenched. He reached into a hidden pocket in his vine braid and pulled out something Ethan hadn't seen before. A rusted flare gun, its barrel pitted, but intact. One flare remained, sealed in plastic. Ethan's eyes widened. "You had that." Caleb's voice was tight. "I saved it," he said, "for this." Ethan's hands shook as he stared at the living mound. "If we shoot it—" Caleb swallowed. "It will react," he said, "and when it reacts, everything on this island moves." Ethan looked behind them. The rock path was narrow, the basin was wide. If the island moved, there would be nowhere to run. Caleb met his gaze. "We do it anyway," he whispered, "because if we don't, we die slowly, or we become voices in the fog." Ethan's mouth went dry. He nodded once. Caleb raised the flare gun with trembling hands, aiming at the pulsing mound. The flare's plastic casing gleamed faintly in the warm mist. The mound pulsed again, slow, heavy, confident. Caleb squeezed the trigger. The flare erupted with a violent hiss, streaking through the mist like a burning comet, and slammed into the core. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the entire basin convulsed. The pale ground rippled outward in waves, fast and violent, like muscle spasming. The mound swelled, then tightened. A deep vibration rolled through the air, low enough to feel in Ethan's teeth. And from the jungle around the basin came a sound that wasn't a roar, wasn't a scream. It was a chorus of human voices, all at once, whispering and crying and calling names, as if the island had opened its mouth and every person it had swallowed tried to speak through it. Ethan stumbled backward, heart exploding with terror. Caleb grabbed him. "Run!" he shouted. But the rock path behind them was already changing. The basalt spine they'd walked on began to sink, its edges softening under a thin layer of pale grit that spread like infection. The island was pulling the ground up around them, reshaping it, closing their escape route like a throat tightening after a bite. Ethan stared in horror as the only safe path began to disappear. And in the basin, the core pulsed faster now, angry, awakened, sending ripples toward them like waves rushing to shore.